Introduce our teacher tonight. His name is Professor JohnMarriott. Let me read the bio for him. John is the adjunct professor to the Philosophy of Religion and Ethics Department at Talbot School of Philosophy and Biola University. He's a former pastor, and he holds an MA in both apologetics and philosophy of religion, and is presently working on a PhD in intercultural studies, focusing on the philosophical presuppositions of Buddhist ethics. For several years, John was associated with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Canada, where he originally is from. While in Canada, John he provided a daily radio commentary entitled Reasonably Speaking that focused on the crossroads of Christianity and Canadian culture. John and his wife Nancy have two children, Cody and Mariah, and they live in Pico Rivera, California. John is a great guy. I got to know him he was a student of mine in class, and now he's a colleague. I didn't teach him anything, not this stuff. He learned other stuff. But he is a colleague now and a friend, and he's very effective at what he does. And that is, he's going to come and teach you on apologetics, which is not, I'm sorry, I'm really, really sorry, but a rational defense for the hope of Christianity. Let's give a warm GLDI welcome to JohnMarriott.
Wow. I was told at dinner tonight when I got here that you were a loud and rowdy crowd, and I said, that can't be true because you're all Korean, and I know that that's not the case. I'll tell you why I say that, because I also teach part-time. While I'm working on the PhD, I teach at an international high school, Christian school. But 90% of the students who go there are non-Christian students who come from China and Korea because they want to get an American high school diploma to get into an American university. So I just want to thank you because I feel right at home tonight. I am the only blonde person in the room once again. And all my students remind me that they like to tell me that the Asians are the superior race, and I say, that's fine because I'm an Asian as well. I'm a Caucasian, and so that's okay. Where the school is located is Rowland Heights, and any of you who are from the Los Angeles area are maybe familiar with Rowland Heights. If you were to drive through, there are places where you will not see a sign with English letters on it. It will be all in either Chinese or Korean characters. And my first week at the school, I'm from a town in northern Ontario, Canada. Almost everyone there would be white or native Canadian Indian. Not much variety there whatsoever. When we moved down here, it wasn't my first experience in a multicultural world, but it was my first experience being immersed in a multicultural world, or another culture in Rowland Heights. And the first week I went out for lunch, I decided, well, I'll just walk somewhere and go somewhere for lunch, and I'll see what's around. And I went to this storefront Chinese restaurant, and the special was a spicy intestine hot pot. Yeah, I said, I don't think so. And then I went out with some friends. They said, let's go to the Vietnamese restaurant. I said, okay. And they said, you should try this. And I said, oh, what is it? And they said, it's the lining of the lining of the stomach of a cow. Exactly. Yeah. I said, no, I don't think so. And then I didn't have anybody to go to lunch with one day, so I said, I know, I'll go to the Korean barbecue across the street. I'll get a hamburger with some teriyaki sauce on it. Everything will be fine. I sat down, I was all by myself. I said, I didn't recognize anything on the menu. I saw the word chicken teriyaki. I said, I'll have that. They brought that to the table. Before they did, they brought all these bowls, which I told them I'd never ordered. But they brought all these tiny little bowls and I recognized almost nothing in the bowls. Until I saw one thing that I was sure I knew what it was, and I knew that it wasn't an intestine, I knew that it wasn't the lining of a stomach, I was sure it was lasagna, and it wasn't. It was kimchi. Yeah. So, yeah, it looked like lasagna to me. It was in a square, and it had like red stuff over it. It looked like it was layered. So, well, it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'm really excited to be a part of this. When Ben told me a little bit about it, I thought, what a great opportunity. And to be quite honest with you, the students that I teach are not Christians. They don't like to learn these things. They come because they want to get into UCLA and USC and UC Irvine and big schools. And some of the other ones that are represented here as well that I see, Yale, UConn, and others. And they don't like to come to Bible class because they don't feel like they came to learn the Bible. And one of the things that they have to do is they come to Bible class every day for 4 years. They have chapel once a week. We go on a retreat with the whole high school in the fall of every year. And the great thing is that even though many of them come with no interest in Christianity, every year we end up baptizing kids because they've come to know the Lord and they're sincere and they want to go on and follow Him. At Christmas we baptized 10 kids, and at the end of the fall semester we baptized 19 kids. Yeah, who are going to go back and who are going to try and make an impact in their world and with their families. Now, I also know that you guys have had a long day. I know you've had a long week, and then you have another, 4 after this one? It's a long 6 weeks process? All right. I'm also very familiar with the look of the tops of Korean folks' heads because they fall asleep a lot in my class. So I will not take that personally. However, I have been given permission to wake you up by throwing something at you or trying to light you on fire with a laser pointer or whatever. Well, we're going to do 3 things tonight. And we're going to try and do them in an economical manner. We're going to take some time for questions either at the end, or if you have a question in the middle, please go ahead and put your hand up. At the university, at Biola University, oh, great. Thanks. We're going to take a quick look at what the definition of apologetics is. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with apologetics and what it is. Some of you probably have some real experience in it and have done some broad reading. We're going to take a look at one particular issue that is perhaps the Achilles heel of the Christian worldview, which is the problem of evil. How in a world where there is so much evil, where so many horrible things take place, can this God that we want people to believe in, how can He exist? Or how can any rational person believe that He exists? And then third, we're going to, and this might be the most valuable thing of the night for you, and it's going to be at the end, and that is going to be, we're going to give you, or I'm going to give you, and you don't have an outline, but I will email the whole PowerPoint, and you'll be able to access the PowerPoint. I don't know who I send it to, but someone will be able to get it, and then you can have it for yourself. The only thing that won't transfer will be some of the video clips. They won't go through because they're on my hard drive. But we're going to have a framework that will help you respond to questions. Any question that you ever get. Now, this is not a silver bullet, but it's a great method to keep you in a driver's seat and to keep you from being on the defensive when someone says, how can you believe in God? Or how could you ever believe in the Bible? Or you don't really believe God created everything, do you? Or you don't really believe that, and just fill in whatever it is that the objection is. This way of discussing with people will help you sort of turn the tables on them, have them provide an explanation and a reason to you for why they have a problem with what you believe, and hopefully it will allow you to find some footing to stay in the conversation. This is the goal. Apologetics is not about winning arguments. It's not even about winning people, because there's always somebody smarter than you out there. I come across articles on the internet all the time, and I say, I have no idea how I would ever answer that question, and here's why. Because every discussion and every issue in apologetics presupposes another belief, and that belief presupposes another belief. And so, for example, my PhD is in the underpinnings of Buddhist ethics. I'm trying to find out why socially engaged Buddhists are socially engaged when on a philosophical level they don't believe that there are enduring persons, that all you are is momentary mental states that happen like this, but there's no one having those mental states. There's no real you. And reincarnation is not the same as in Hinduism, where it's the same you that gets reincarnated perhaps into a different body at a different level. It's just the mental states with the karma that gets attached to them that keeps going on. Now, if there are no real people, That means that from the time you entered this room until now, you are not the same person. There's just some mental states. Why care about mental states that don't endure and who won't even experience their karmic results in the future if there's not a real person there? Well, someone might say, but you're assuming something about the mind and the brain, that the brain is not just a meat computer that gives you the illusion that you're a person. And then you get off into the whole discipline of philosophy of mind and whether or not minds and brains are the same things. And then you find that there's a whole literature devoted to this topic. And unless you master the topic and rise to the top of it, you will never be able to answer every question that relates to the mind and the brain and persons and evil and all that kind of stuff. So what we want to do is we want to be the best that we can be. We want to be the sharpest tool that we can be with what God's equipped us for. So that when he needs a tool and he looks into his toolbox, he says, okay, here's a sharp tool that I can use in this case. So apologetics isn't trying to win arguments. It's not even really trying to win people. It's trying to help other people see what we believe we've discovered. And walking alongside of them and sharing with them what we have encountered. We're going to take a quick look at apologetics as a definition. We're going to look at the problem of evil. Then we're going to take a look at a formula for response. Then we'll have a big Q&A time afterwards. But if you have any questions as we go along, please just put up your hand and we'll address it. Because if you're thinking it, maybe someone else is as well. Oh, okay. When we talk about apologetics, Ben mentioned that apologetics is not saying you're sorry for anything. And if you want to get a master's degree in apologetics and you think that it means saying sorry, just get married. Then you will get a master's degree in apologizing. Yes. Right? Apologetics is simply defined as a defense of the Christian faith. The word comes out of the Greek as apologia, and it means to speak away. It's the exact same thing that an attorney does in a courtroom. So right now, Trayvon Martin case with George Zimmerman in Florida is a really big case. His lawyers are going to try and speak away the charges. They're bringing charges against George Zimmerman saying he is guilty of murder, and here's why. Here are all the reasons why he did something wrong. Well, the lawyer is going to stand up and say, no, George Zimmerman is not guilty, and here's why. He is going to defend George Zimmerman. Apologetics is giving a defense for what we believe. And I think that apologetics is primarily defensive. I think that we preach the gospel, we share the gospel with people, and then when people have questions and they have challenges to it, then we respond to those. But we're not trying to convince people immediately by, say, some argument in the truthfulness of it before they even understand what the message is. Arguments never really persuade anybody. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. My friend Stephen was a really smart guy, was going to Bible college in Edmonton. I know there's at least one person in here who knows where Edmonton is, my fellow Canadian. And he had a friend who was a Christian who was going to the University of Alberta, also in Edmonton. And his friend was not really articulate, but he was very on fire for the Lord. And he had a roommate who was not a Christian and was very antagonistic towards Christianity. So he said, Steve, can you come over and talk to my roommate for me? He doesn't listen to anything I say. And Steve said, is this guy interested? He said, yeah, he'd like to have this discussion. Steve goes over and he said for 2 hours they discussed, and Steve unloaded every argument that he could think of for why this guy should become a Christian based on the truthfulness of Christianity. And in between, whenever Steve would pause to take a breath, his friend, the roommate, would say, and Jesus really loves you. And Jesus really loves you. And Steve said, in my mind, I was getting so mad at him because I'm trying to present an intellectual argument for the trustworthiness of the existence of God, and he just jumps in with all this, and Jesus really loves you, warm and fuzzy stuff. The discussion ended. It went really nowhere. There was no progress made. Stephen left. He went to a hockey game. At the end of the hockey game, he came out. Here come the two roommates, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing. Steve says, hey, what's so funny? What did I miss? And the antagonistic guy says, well, you're not going to believe this, Steve, but after you left, I became a Christian. Steve said, well, what was it that I said? He said, well, it wasn't really anything that you said. I didn't find anything that you said fairly persuasive at all. I just realized that if Jesus really loves me as much as this guy says, right? So it's not arguments that are going to win people, but God might use our arguments. God might use our discussions. And here's an example of that. When I was 17 years old, I had, I had just regular teenage kind of acne, but I was very self-aware of it, and I felt embarrassed of it, and I did everything I could to try and get rid of it. And one night, I was staying at a friend's home, and we were going on a hockey tournament the next day. And he had a sister who was very pretty. Her name was Kelly, and I had a kind of a crush on her. And both his bedroom I was sleeping in and her bedroom were side by side down in the basement of the house. Some of you from outside of California know what those are. And I waited until I thought everyone was in bed, and then I snuck into the bathroom, and I applied this technique that I had read about in a magazine that supermodels use to get rid of their blemishes, and that was putting toothpaste on, So I came out of the bathroom, I looked around, I had toothpaste blots all over my face, snuck down the stairs, and Kelly was hanging up clothes, drying them in front of the fire. And she turned around and said, "Hey, I got a question." And she just looked at me, and I have all this toothpaste on my face. And she, kind of laughed, and I explained why I did it. And she said, "Well, do you mind if I ask you some questions?" And she wanted to know about, she had met Christians before. She had read a little bit of the Bible. I have all this toothpaste all over my face. She wants to have a theological conversation with me. And I said, okay. So we talked for probably a couple hours. And at the end of it, she said, "Okay, I want to become a Christian now." Years later, I said, "Hey, Kelly, remember that night?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm sure the answers I gave you weren't very good. And I had toothpaste all over my face. Why'd you become a Christian?" And she said, "Because I really thought it was something that I wanted, and you provided me with the answers that I needed at the time, even if they really weren't good answers looking back on it now." Right? Arguments aren't going to win anybody, but sometimes God takes our reasoned responses and helps people to recognize that he really is there. There are people who could care less about rational arguments for Christianity. There are people who need rational arguments for Christianity. And God has provided those things. Yes? No, I don't know who in the world would ever think that toothpaste would work. I mean, it just irritates it, right? Because toothpaste has that sort of like burning kind of effect. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good at all. It was terrible. All right. Apologetics, though, is a little bit more than defensive. Apologetics is the art or persuasion, the discipline which seeks to commend the Christian faith to those outside of the family of God. We do want to persuade people, right? We want to do some persuasive kind of preaching at times. We want to not just defend it, but we want to say, hey, you should become a Christian, and here are some of the reasons why you should become a Christian. Not just always responding, perhaps, to questions. Alistair McGrath at Oxford says, Christianity must commend itself in terms of its relevance to life, not just its inherent rationality. We need to have a full-orbed apologetic. It doesn't just make good intellectual sense. It's not just a rationally coherent worldview, but it really infuses your life with meaning. It will infuse your life with purpose. And even better than that, we believe that it's based on truth. Right? I'm sure that people find meaning and purpose in other worldviews and in other religions, but we want to say that ours is going to come not because it provides you with community or not because it will give you an experience in worship, but because it's really true. Here's Paul's perspective. Thank you. Here's some scriptural basis for apologetics. I hope you can see this. It's a little small. In Acts 18:4, it says, and this is referring to Paul, he addressed both the Jews and Greeks in the synagogue every Sabbath, attempting to persuade them. Paul is he's not just preaching the gospel, but after he preaches the gospel, he tries to persuade them that it's true. He goes through the Old Testament when it comes to the Jews, and he says, Jesus is the fulfillment of these things. Look, here are some good reasons to believe Jesus is who he claims to be, and he is who I claim him to be when I preach. When he ends up on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, instead of going to the Old Testament, which of course the Gentiles and the Greeks at the time wouldn't have been familiar with, Paul reasons with them from their own prophets. Paul reasons with them, and he doesn't appeal to the Old Testament, but he discusses things with them that would have been meaningful for them. and he tries to persuade them as well. In 2 Corinthians 5:11, he says, therefore, because we know the fear of the Lord, we try and persuade people. He tries to persuade people because he knows what awaits people who don't know the Lord. In Acts 27, before Agrippa, Paul says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I wish to God that whether in a short or a long time, not only you, but all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. You guys are such an affirming, encouraging group. Right? And in verse 24, Paul is giving his defense. So this is the same chapter. This is chapter 26. It says he's trying to persuade, but here he's giving a defense. It will overlap at times. Now, I think that apologetics has real value for people who are outside the Christian faith, but I will tell you, I think that has even greater value for Christians. When I was in Bible college, I went to Bible college for a couple years, I really had a crisis of faith where I wondered whether or not I really believed this stuff anymore. And I really had to reevaluate my life. And it was at that point that I came across a gentleman named Ravi Zacharias. Now, some of you, especially if you're from the East Coast, will know a little bit more about Ravi. But he is from India. At 14, he tried to take his life because he thought life had no meaning. He was from the Brahmin priestly class of a Hindu family. Eventually, they emigrated to Canada, where he was taking a course in hotel management, of all things. And someone said, you need to go to seminary. He went to Trinity Seminary in Chicago, and from there, his ministry took off. And he speaks around the world, mostly to people who are culture shapers, who are high-end, well-placed political people. So, for example, Yasser Arafat, before Yasser Arafat passed away, he spoke in the Politburo in the former Soviet Union. These are the types of people that Ravi engages with because he's very articulate, and he's very good to listen to, but he's very intelligent. And he presents a Christian worldview in a way that is intellectually satisfying. And so I started listening to Ravi. And several years later, probably when I was in my mid-20s, the same age some of you are, I had the opportunity to meet Ravi. It was in an auditorium. It was quite a bit bigger than this. It was same shape, though, right? So the seats just keep going up. And I got there early because I wanted to ask him some questions afterwards. And I didn't want a soundbite question. I wanted to really engage with him on something. So I sat right where you're sitting, right in the front row, right down. He could not miss me because that's exactly where I was. Then I outweighted everybody else after the question and answer time was over, except for a couple other people who probably had the same strategy as I did. Ravi saw us standing there. He came over. He put out his hand. He said, thank you very much for coming. I put out my hand. I said, I just want to say, and I started to tear up. And I started not to cry, but I got choked up. And I wanted to tell him how much I appreciated his ministry and how much it helped me make it through some very dark intellectual times in my life. And I think that apologetics is really influential and important for Christians, those who are already persuaded of their faith, but who are being bombarded on a daily basis because they live in a hostile or they work in a hostile environment, like many of you, if not all of you do. I've gone to a secular university, University of Waterloo in Canada, ranked number 1 usually in Canada. I know what it's like to be in a hostile environment. I know what it's like to have teachers stand up and say, look, I know that there are some of you in here who believe in God, but I don't want to hear about it in this class. I don't want to hear your objections to evolution. I had one professor who came to class. She spoke about how her son has a learning disability and she is just at the end of her rope, and she wants to know, is there anything out there that can help her cope? It is just her and her son. She said, I've tried everything. I waited about a week. I sent her a nice email. Tried to make it sound very intellectual, because she's a professor. I told her I was sympathetic towards her plight, and I had a friend who has the same struggles, same learning disability as her son. And I shared with her that that some of my friends who came to the end of their rope and investigated the claims of Christianity, found them very intellectually satisfying, and were persuaded of the truth of it. And because of that, they committed their lives to Jesus Christ, and he didn't take away the problem, but he gave them a means to cope with it. I heard nothing back from her. So a month later, I went to her office. I introduced myself, and she said, "Oh yeah, you're the guy who sent me the email." Well, just let me tell you something. In my family, we deal in reality, and the reality is that we will never worship a bearded male deity. And then she went on to tell me about all the horrible things that happened in the history of the church. No sympathy whatsoever. So I know, and I'm sure if we went around the room, almost everybody in here could tell a story of a professor or a TA or people in the dorms or encountering other clubs on campus that are hostile to your faith. I think apologetics is really important for Christians if you want to have an intellectually fulfilled and satisfying faith. So it is not just trying to persuade others, but it is also beneficial for us too. So here's my proposed working definition. It's long, but we're going to shorten it to just 3 things. I think that apologetics is primarily don't copy it. I'll send you the PowerPoint. Is the defense of the Christian faith and the art and science of commending the Christian faith to those outside of the family of God. The aim is being the removal of barriers to faith and the provision of reasons for faith. It's person-centered. There's no method that's the best method. We want to be in a dialogue with people. We really want to hear what their objections are. It's a person-centered approach that is sensitive to its audience, expressing ideas in a way they can understand and affirm. While primarily an intellectual endeavor, it's reinforced by a life which reflects the character of Christ. I think that that's really, really important, that last part. Because people really don't, well, let me just put it to you this way. How many of you would really want to become a fundamentalist Muslim? If you were convinced that it was, persuaded that it was true. Probably not, because we have one. We have one here. Find her and marry her, men, because she is seeking the truth, and she will choose the truth regardless of whether or not it's palatable to her. But I think the rest of us probably don't want to become fundamentalist Muslims, because when we look at it, we just find it so unappealing. Right? Oh, you all want to know who it is now? All the girls now are putting up their hands. Oh, it was really me. It was really me. If people don't find what you believe appealing, then they're not going to want to believe it, even if it's true. I mean, most of the times that people raise objections, it are things like this. Yeah, but what about the Crusades? What about the witch trials? What about the Inquisition? Why would I ever want to be a part of an organization or a movement that did all of those terrible things? Look, even if it's true, I'm not really interested in it. Or it can't be true because it's just has such an egregious history. We could summarize this then by saying that apologetics is proclamational. We're proclaiming the truth. We want to tell people, we're going to persuade it, we're going to defend, we're going to let people know that Christianity is true. It's dialogical. Dialogical just means it's something that we're in a dialogue with people about. We listen. It's not just preaching at people. It's not kind of cramming our belief down their throat or beating them over the head with our Bible or our good logical arguments, even though we may have very good logical arguments. And lastly, it's incarnational. It needs to be reinforced by a life that people find attractive and people find appealing. There needs to be a winsomeness there. And if there's not, that might just be personality. But certainly we don't want to give people any reasons to take offense before we ever even get to communicate because they find us personally offensive. Sorry, I just wish they'd make this thing simpler. All right. Let's just stop real quick and say, are there any questions then just about what we're talking about when we talk about apologetics? Is there air conditioning in the room?
Amen.
Oh, okay. Can we open it? Yeah. Don't make fun of the way she talks.
Can you say about?
About? Yeah, you'll pick that up a little bit.
Way to be awkward, dude.
Here's the problem of evil. Right, so you have a skeptic, and the skeptic says, I have a serious problem with belief in God. And you say to them, okay, well, what's your problem? And they say, well, look, my problem is how can an all-powerful good God and evil both exist? And that's a good question. This is a big obstacle for some people. It's a big obstacle because everybody will experience some evil in their lifetime. And sometimes the answer to the problem of evil is not necessarily going to require, and probably most times will not require, an intellectual response, a rational argument. It will need more of a pastoral. Maybe you should just sit and be quiet and put your arm around them. Because sometimes when people are going through suffering, as all of you know, and they say, why did God let this happen to me? Probably the worst thing that you could do is sort of bust out the discussion that we're going to talk about tonight. Right? That's not what they want. They want a friend. They want someone. And when God responds to the problem of evil, he does it in a personal way. He does not do it through a logical syllogism, but he sends Jesus into the world who goes through evil, who suffers everything that we suffer, all types of suffering. And he provides for us someone who can empathize and someone who can sympathize. He does not primarily give us answers to all of our questions. And there's a reason for that, and we'll see why. So at the end of the day, there is no answer definitively to the problem of evil. There is no answer. There's no silver bullet. But there is good reason to believe that God knows what he's doing, and he's trustworthy, and that he's good. The problem of evil manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Here's an example that I found in a movie that many of you are familiar with. It's I Am Legend with Will Smith, where if you're not familiar with the storyline, I won't ruin it for you, but Will Smith creates a virus, it goes airborne, it mutates, makes just about everybody in the world, kills them all, or... Oh, sorry, am I ruining it for you? I'm not going to tell you the end of the story, don't worry, I won't tell you what happens. I won't tell you what happens. So all these, just plug your ears. The majority of the people on planet Earth either die, the ones that survive become these horrific, mutated, cannibal-like creatures, and they feed off the tiny, tiny percentage of people who are left who are immune to the virus. And Will Smith and this woman who he's encountered are immune to the virus, and they've escaped to this house, and she says, listen, things are better now. And she's going to tell him that God has a plan in the midst of all of this. Oh. I got it. Do you want me to I can just go like this. Hmm?
Just hold the mic.
Where's the? We could.
Just try it. Or you might.
6 billion people infection hit. KV had a 90% kill rate. That's 5.4 billion people.
I don't even know where the speaker is on this.
Crashed.
Unplug what?
It should have been. No, it did last time.
That's not right.
Well, here's what happens.
The sound comes through the keyboard. It's a MacBook Air, right?
No, it's not an Air,
Oh.
but it does sound like it's coming through the
Is it
keyboard.
13-inch MacBook Pro?
Yes.
It's probably coming through the keyboard. Yeah. Bottom of the keyboard. Where the crease of the laptop is. The crease.
The other 500 million
He's just gonna have to tell us.
turned into your dark seekers. And then they got hungry.
Oh, it's working. Hold on. We got to go back now.
Can you increase the volume on your laptop?
I don't think so.
No, like right there. Oh, it's already on. So okay.
Okay, you just have to be really quiet.
You just have to listen. If you listen, you can hear God's plan.
God's plan.
Yeah.
All right, let me tell you about your God's plan. 6 billion people on Earth when you infect.
Oh, sorry. That was my fault. I touched the keyboard with the microphone.
Good world.
When the infection hit, KV had a 90% kill rate. That's 5.4 billion people dead, crashed, and bled out dead. That's a 1% immunity. It left 12 million healthy people like you, me, and Ethan. The other 588 million turned into your dark seekers. And then they got hungry. And they killed and fed on everybody. Everybody. Every single person that you or I has ever known is dead. Dead. There is no God. There is no God.
I might need it again. Yeah. Okay. All right. There are two problems here. There's a logical incompatibility problem that says God and evil just are logically incompatible. They don't go together. There's a logical problem. It's like saying a woman can be pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. You can be a square circle. These things are impossible because they're logically incompatible. They violate the law of non-contradiction. These things can't happen. Well, how can a good, loving God and evil exist? This seems to be a logical contradiction. So there's an example. Another one is gratuitous evil is the problem. Gratuitous means there's just way too much of it, right? And so gratuitous evil is the objection that says even if you can solve the problem of evil from a logical perspective, you have another problem, and that's this. There's too much of it. It's one thing to say that evil and God are compatible logically, that there's no logical reason that they can't exist. But there's no good reason that if God exists that would ever justify him in all of the horrendous evils that we see. So the 20th century, as you know, is more bloody than all of the other 19 combined. Just think of all the horrendous evils that went on. Atheistic regimes alone, communist atheistic regimes alone, killed over 150 million of their own people in peacetime. This is not people killing other people. This is not World War II, World War I, conflicts around the world. This is people inflicting democide, murder by government, on their own people. So there's just horrific examples of evil. One of those is moral evil. There's a difference between moral evil and natural evil. We're not going to take a look at natural evil tonight because we don't have time. But natural evil would be the evil that takes place when tornadoes hit trailer parks, or hurricanes go into New Orleans, or fires ravage Colorado. There's no personal agent behind any of those. There's nothing that we can say, the fire shouldn't have done this or the hurricane shouldn't have done this. That makes no sense, because when we talk about should and ought, that's a moral category, and we refer to moral agents, people who have minds, who should know better or can be praised for their actions. Moral evil is just that. Moral evil is the evil that takes place because people do bad stuff. Here's the argument. The following premises cannot all be true. Number one, God is all-powerful. Number two, God is all good. Number three, an all-powerful and good God would vanquish evil. Evil exists, therefore God doesn't exist. The first thing that you should know about this is that you should notice is that this is not a logically valid argument. The conclusion does not follow from the premises, even though people kind of assume that it does. You would have to change premise 3 to say an all-powerful and good God would vanquish evil immediately. Because an all-powerful and good God would vanquish evil, and we could add, and he will. Right? That would change everything. And he will. Don't worry, there are editors, I'm sure, for the video that they're making right now. They can edit that out. They're going to edit this guy out over here. And well, why is this the case? Well, here's the argument as it gets expanded, because anytime you see an argument like this, you know that there has to be some dots that get connected between the premises. There's lots of us built-in assumptions here. And one is because if God was all good and all powerful, evil would not exist, but evil does exist. So you're left with just a couple options. One is that God is either all good, but not all powerful. Rabbi Harry Kushner, who wrote the book in the 1980s, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, New York Times bestseller, wrote it because his son died, and he could not understand how a loving God would ever let this happen. And he said, God cannot be both all-powerful and all good. So he said, better to choose an all-good God than an all-powerful God. Because it's better to worship an all-good God who would like to do good stuff but always can't, than an all-powerful God who just might be evil. And his argument was, God hates evil, but he is impotent to do anything about it. He has no power to stop a lot of the evil that exists in the world. Or you say God is powerful but not all good. There's not a lot of people who want to choose that. But both moral and natural evil exist, and so therefore God just doesn't. How can he? He's good. He would want to get rid of it. He's powerful. He could get rid of it. But evil exists. So either he's not all good, or he's not all powerful, or he just doesn't exist at all. And for a Christian, the option is you either defend the claim that God exists and refute this argument, or you say, you're right, God doesn't exist, because we can't kind of go halfway, because we really believe that the Bible teaches, and classical theology has always taught, that God is both all good and all powerful. Now, all powerful doesn't mean that God can do anything, though. Can any of you think of things that God can't do? Okay. That's going to be part of our answer when we get to discussing how do we respond to this question. Because it does come, even if we can diffuse this logical part, there's still an emotional, kind of an intuitive, yeah, but it doesn't seem right kind of part that we need to talk about. Well, moral evil results from the misuse of some sense of free will that we have on the part of an agent in a way that the agent thereby becomes morally blameworthy for the resultant evil. Moral evil, therefore, includes specific acts of intentional wrongdoing, like lying. My students all the time tell me I lie to them, because I'll say to them, well, this afternoon we're going to have a pep rally, and it gets canceled. They say, you lied to us. I say, I didn't lie. That was a mistake. I told you something wrong, but lying involves deception, intentionally deceiving people. I didn't intentionally deceive you. Right? Well, that's why it says that there's an intentional wrongdoing up here. You are not morally responsible in some ways unless there's an intentionality. We even see this when it comes to murder. We have first, second, third degree murder and manslaughter. Manslaughter, you're still held responsible, but you may not have intentionally killed somebody. So there is a responsibility, but the intentional level, the intentionality level determines the moral culpability. So lying, murdering, any defects in character like being dishonest or being greedy, all of these things are examples of the moral problem of evil. People say it is logically incompatible with God. I don't know if this is worth taking a look at because I have to put the microphone up to the keyboard again. But here the skeptic says, here's a particularly good example of moral evil. You tell me how God could ever allow this to happen. This is a story of Joseph Fritzl. Some of you may have heard this. It might be in the back of your head, and this may jog your story, your mind. At 18 years old, Joseph Fritzl took his daughter and put her in a dungeon apartment that he had built without his wife knowing. Had his daughter write a letter saying that she was running away. I don't think it was with the circus, but it was some group that she was running away from home with. And for the next 25 years, Joseph Fritzl locked his own daughter in the basement of the dungeon underneath that he had built, an apartment down there with lights, running water and everything. Had a secret lock, padlocked, combination lock on the door. She didn't see the sun for 25 years. She fathered 8 children to her own father. One died, he threw it in the furnace. The children didn't stand up straight because the building that he had built for them, they were taller than the roof, and so they walked bent over like this, and some of them had never seen the sun. There's a good example of moral evil. And by the way, when someone tells you that morality is completely relative and there are no absolute moral facts, and there are no moral truths, and morality is cultural, you need to tell them a story like Joseph Fritzl and ask, was Joseph Fritzl simply doing something that you find distasteful or morally wrong? And if they simply say distasteful, then you probably can't go any farther with them in any kind of a discussion because 1, they are not being rational. 2, you should tell them that they probably need psychiatric help. Don't ever invite them over to your house because I can give you all kinds of arguments for absolute morality, true moral facts. But if you cannot see the existence of a true moral wrongdoing in an illustration in a story like this, you will never come to that conclusion by some rational argument. Well, there's an example of moral evil. So how can God and evil exist at the same time? This is logically incompatible. There's a contradiction inherent in both of these things existing. Well, I'm not really quite so sure. I'm not sure that there really is a logical problem at all. And those people who are going to raise this issue with you, especially if they really try and push that there's a logical incompatibility here, and they kind of run this argument like, God's all good, God's all powerful, you'll still see this. But you never see it anymore in any kind of philosophy of religion literature. Believe it or not, this is pretty much a dead and defeated argument. Peter Van Inwagen, who was at Notre Dame, I'm not sure if he's still there now, in the book, The Evidential Argument from Evil, writes, it used to be widely held that evil, which for present purposes we may identify with undeserved pain and suffering, was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I'm able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended. Now, Van Inwagen is a theist, but Michael Martin, who, believe it or not, is graduated from Harvard, is the professor emeritus at Boston University, and does not have a picture of his face anywhere on the internet. I Googled him for hours. I Google image searched him forever. A Yahoo image searched him everywhere. I looked under every conceivable, like philosopher of religion, his name, atheist, you name it. I found lots of books by him. No pictures. If you find one and you want to email it to me, that would be great. He says theologians who don't believe in God, so atheists, have usually construed this as a deductive argument, the logical problem of evil. However, this approach has generally been regarded as unsuccessful. Evidential Argument from Evil is the name of the book. Paul Draper, who's at Purdue, said, I agree with most philosophers of religion that theists face no serious logical problem of evil. William Rowe, who is perhaps the most ardent critic of a good, loving, moral God existing. He's an atheist. He graduated from, I forget which Bible college it was. He went to the University of Chicago. He wanted to be a minister. He went to seminary in Chicago. He subsequently lost his faith, and then he became a philosopher of religion and to advocate for atheism. Did you have a question? Oh. Okay. Well, here's William Rowe. Yes? It depends on who you ask, but generally, morals are the way that they're synonymous for the most part. Okay, but yeah, the definition of the words kind of apply to this. Morals or mores are how people behave. Ethics is how they ought to behave. So ethics is prescriptive. It prescribes you ought to do this, you should not do that. But that's sort of the etymology or the history of the words. One is descriptive, which would be morality. One is prescriptive, which is ethics. But they're synonymous in contemporary usage. Morality generally or ethics generally just means it's the study of how people ought to behave. They're similar. They're synonymous. You need to be an ethical person. Ethical people. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with the distinction as it's used, how you've just outlined it, but I would say that that's definitely true, that there are different, cultures have different morals. You could argue then that people like C.S. Lewis and many others have outlined, though, that have listed that cultures share very similar ethics, if you wanted to make that distinction. So we might say that there's a culture that thinks that it is moral to, and this is true, and years ago, and not during any of our lifetimes, but a long time ago, Inuit people up in northern Canada. You gotta go like that. Yeah, okay. We can't. Don't let Chicago beat us on this. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. I said it. Used to put their old elderly people on ice floes, and send them off to freeze to death. We don't do that. Okay. I could be wrong here, and this is dangerous ground, but my students affirm this, that they don't take the Korean students I have don't take their grandparents and stuff them in an old folks' home because it's disrespectful, right? But we do here in North America, oftentimes. Well, that might be a different moral or social moray that people have, but we both share the same ethic. We both think that we should be doing what's best for our aged grandparents and parents. One culture says, well, we think the best thing to do is bring them into our home. Another culture says, we think the best thing to do is put them in a place where, I don't know, maybe this is just rationalizing. They will have really, 3 square meals a day and have lots of people in their own peer category and they'll be entertained and well taken care of medically. I don't know, but we both believe that you should care for. So there's the same underlying ethical value. And if you want to talk about morality being mores or descriptions of how people act, then yes, there are different ways that people act out and interpret those deep-held ethical values. Universally, it's very difficult to find any kind of a culture that has radically different values. They will argue, people have different opinions on how those should be acted out. But just about everybody universally believes in justice, believes in fairness. They just think that in a caste society like some places in India, that the low, untouchable class is getting exactly what they deserve, right? Because of their previous life. And the high priestly Brahmin class is getting exactly what they deserve. So there is justice there. Now, in the American Declaration of Independence, it says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. So we think that that's just. There are different opinions as to what justice is, but we all believe that justice is something that we should be pursuing and seeking after. We kind of see it from different facets at times. But no one says, hey, we want to have a completely unjust society. Why? That would be good. Oh, so we should do good things. Yeah, I guess so. Everybody believes you should do the good and not do the bad. We just differ as sometimes as to what we think is good and bad. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. Thanks. Here's William Rowe. Probably some of you zoned out while I was talking and maybe read this, and he just says, hey, some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. Indeed, the existence of evil is logically consistent with the existence of the theistic God. This is from the book, The Evidential Argument from Evil. So here's Van Enwagen again. He ends by saying, it's fairly widely agreed by theists and non-theists alike that Alvin Plantinga, he is the primary guy here, Keith Yandell, and other theistic philosophers have cast serious doubt on the viability of all formulations of the theological problem. Many of you would be familiar with the magazine Christianity Today. John Stackhouse, who often writes in it and may actually be an editor. He is the Sang Woo Professor of Theology at Regent Seminary up in British Columbia, yes. He says, in the so-called free will defense, Plantinga answered the logical problem of evil, an apparently lethal argument that boldly claims theists cannot simultaneously affirm three propositions: that God is good, that God is all-powerful, and that evil exists. And this is Alvin Plantinga. To encourage you, there is a renaissance in analytic American philosophy. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of some of the highest regard philosophers on the scene today who are evangelical Christians. Some who aren't evangelical but are conservative Christians in their theology. Alvin Plantinga has been described as not only the most significant Christian philosopher, but the most significant philosopher of any stripe in America. He is Reformed. He used to teach at Calvin College. He's sort of professor emeritus at Notre Dame. And he was the head of the American Philosophical Association. So he is like the biggest of the big. And he is the most unsung hero in the Christian world, because he has laid out some very persuasive arguments for, one, why God and evil are not illogical; two, why only within a Christian worldview can you even have knowledge; and three, because he's argued that he calls it the evidential argument against naturalism, which basically just says this: if evolution is true, we have no good reason to believe in any of the deliverances of our senses, so we have no good reason to be naturalists. He has done just an incredible amount of work for Christians on the level that many of you are turning in. And so I would really encourage you to discover some of his work. He also sort of looks like a leprechaun or Abraham Lincoln. I don't know why he doesn't grow a mustache. He was just at Biola, which is where Ben and I teach, and Scott Ray, who will be here tomorrow, who you'll really enjoy. So let's then respond to the moral problem of evil using Alvin Plantinga's discussion. Now, before we do that, we need to make one more distinction, and it's this. That's between a defense and a theodicy. A defense is when we say, look, all attempts to show that the existence of God and the existence of evil are incompatible fail. We want to be able to say that God and evil are compatible. We're not going to try and explain how. We're not going to try and justify God's reasons for doing it. All we're going to say is your argument fails. You want to say that God and evil cannot coexist, but your argument fails. Now they may turn around and say, well, how do God and evil coexist together? And you might say, I'm not exactly sure, but you have not given an argument to show that it can't. Now you can go farther and say some things, but it doesn't try to offer reasons that would justify God allowing evil. Most people who are kind of on this side in the apologetic philosophy of religion world are going to say, we may never know the reasons. So an argument like this would go, a defense would sound like this. You've claimed that God and evil are logically incompatible. They can't go together. But I'm going to show you that A, your argument is unsuccessful. B, that God and evil are not logically incompatible. So I will say something positive here. I will make a claim. And when you say, okay, then if they are compatible, what reasons do you think God could have? We're going to say, I don't know. Who am I to know the mind of God? I don't even understand pre-calculus. So how would I ever know the mind of God? And I say that sort of seriously, right? Probably most of you know pre-calculus, but I certainly don't. Now, a theodicy is actually going to go one step further and is going to try and offer a reason that justifies why God would allow evil. They're going to say, hey, your argument fails. You haven't shown that God and evil are incompatible. And I've shown you that God and evil logically are compatible. And I'm going to tell you why I think God may be justified in allowing evil to occur. And some reasons that have been offered are things like this, that the knowledge of God is such a great thing that we would never be able to enter into it without some evil in the world. Because how would we ever understand compassion? How would we ever understand grace or mercy unless there was something to be graceful and merciful for? So knowing about God and entering into what he's like and this kind of divine relationship with him, actually evil might be part of what's required to do that, and so therefore God's justified in doing that because that's such a great good. Human happiness, you might say, well, that sort of sounds like a paradox. How could human happiness is the reason why God allowed evil in the world? They don't really go together, but people have argued that. Other people will argue, hey, God's glory is the highest kind of thing in the chain of being. And God's glory is best, God is best glorified in sending his son into the world and saving sinful people. And that is such a great good that it allows and it justifies God for letting evil come into the world. Now, you might not like any of those, and you'd need to hear them kind of cashed out to see whether or not they're persuasive, but that's kind of what a theodicy sounds like. We're not going to do a theodicy tonight. Way too much work, and quite honestly, I don't know how much biblical justification there is for theodicies. Because when God has an opportunity to give reasons for why he does what he does, in the book of Job, he doesn't give any. Job seems to almost deconstruct the whole idea of theodicy to some degree, because Job says, I demand an answer. I want to know, why did you let all this happen? And God answers Job with 64 questions. That's his answer. He says, okay, I'll tell you, Job, what my reasons are and what justifies me putting you through this horrible hell on earth kind of experience, but you have to tell me this first. And he asks him 64 questions about the natural world. And Job says, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm going to put my hand over my mouth and sit here in silence. And I think God kind of says, he doesn't go on and say this, but the implication is, when you can tell me how the basics of how the physical world operates, then I'll tell you how the moral, metaphysical world operates. So theodicies, while they might be kind of helpful in helping us think about why God might do it, I'm not sure that we really know, and I'm not sure that God, when he has the opportunity to tell us, he doesn't. And he may not tell us for various reasons, and we'll take a look at those in a minute. Okay, so here we go. This is Alvin Plantinga's response. This is his defense, not his theodicy. This is his defense. He's going to make this first part of his argument. He says, a world with moral good is better than a world without moral good. A world where people can choose to love, where people can choose to sacrifice, they can be compassionate, is better than a world of automaton robots who are programmed to go around saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, and being compassionate. Because compassion and love really mean that you have to choose to give yourself to someone. A moral world is better than a world without moral good. He's not saying a moral good is better than a moral world is better than an immoral world. He's just saying that if you had a world where there was no real moral or ethical choices that people were inclined to make and they could do good, that would not be as good of a world where you can have people making moral good choices. This seems to be fairly not not too controversial. People don't respond too aggressively to that. Number 2, agents with morally significant free will are needed for there to be moral good. Premise number 3, even God cannot create free moral agents who never go wrong. Premise 4, therefore God cannot create a world with moral good and without the possibility of moral evil. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide because we're going to break each one down, so you don't have to worry about copying it down, because it's going to be on the next slide. Here's number 1. Fairly obvious, I think. Not too many people think that a world with just amoral robots wandering around would be better than a world with true moral people. Number 2, agents with morally significant free will are needed for there to be moral good. Why do you think that is? What's that? Okay. And what seems to be involved in making a moral decision? Exactly. Choice, right? There needs to be real choice going on. If there is no principle of alternative possibility, PAP, principle of alternative possibility, which just means this, that you could have chosen other than you did. If there is no possibility that you could have done otherwise, it's not a moral choice. You are forced to do it. We don't hold people morally responsible for things they had no choice over. When people are insane, criminally insane, we don't hold them responsible. We may put them in places to keep them safe and to protect society, but we're not saying that they're morally responsible for the evil that they committed. A funny example of this is I was watching the news, and I have a clip of it. You can find it online. There was a hypnotist in Italy who was so good. He could go up to the counter when he was paying his bill, hypnotize the man or the woman behind the counter at the cash register taking the money. He would hypnotize the ladies to take the money out of the cash register and hand it to him, and then he would just walk out of the store. They have him caught on videotape. And you can see he's talking to the lady. He does it all in about 30 seconds. And then you just see them open up the till, take out the money, hand him the money. He takes his stuff and all the money from the till, and he leaves. Yeah. If we gave one of you tonight, Chicago, if we gave him a drink, and in the drink there was something that caused him to kind of zone, to sort of just kind of lose mental focus for a little bit and kind of turn him into a little bit of a zombie, and then we hypnotize him, and he's not, it's not against it, it's kind of against his will, but it's not even against his will because he doesn't know any better. And then we say to him, okay, we want you to go up and we want you to punch Ben Shin in the stomach 10 times. So he gets up and he walks up, comes and sits back down. Now, maybe when the higher-ups hear about this, he gets kicked out, or there's a big problem, he gets in big trouble, but then all of you say, it really wasn't his fault because we tricked him into drinking something, then we hypnotized him, he had no choice in the matter, he was just doing what he was determined to do. And that's really the case with this hypnotist in Italy. None of these women are charged with any crimes because there was no principle of alternative possibility. They had no other choice because he had control over them because he had hypnotized them. You are only morally responsible when you have the principle of alternative possibilities exist. If you cannot do otherwise, then you are not a moral person. My wife, I didn't say Chicago, did I? No. Okay. Oh, okay. No, go ahead. No, because well, I don't know all the legal ins and outs of being drunk, but I think that if you get married when you're drunk, I'm not sure that counts. Does that count? I know all the movies it does. Like, it what? Okay, you can get it annulled, right? Because they say you weren't really in your right mind, but it doesn't count if you hit somebody and you're driving a car, right? Because they say that you willfully chose to get drunk. That was under your control. Yes, you chose to put yourself in that situation. So the moral responsibility does stop at you. In the other case where we hypnotized you, the moral responsibility passes right through you and stops at me because I hypnotized you. Yes. Yes. Did you? Okay. Oh, well, look, if my wife, if my wife's programmed to tell me every morning, I love you, I love you, I love you, she doesn't really love me, right? She's not choosing to love me. Love only is love when you give yourself to someone or you make this moral choice. Likewise with doing anything good or doing anything bad. If there's going to be moral good in the world, there has to be this free will. If we got rid of all free will, we would get rid of evil, but we would also get rid of everything in the universe that truly is good. Love, companionship, acts of sacrifice, heroicism, compassion. All of those things would be gone because people wouldn't be doing them because they're making a choice to do them, which is what really a moral choice is. It's when you make it. They would be doing it because they've been predetermined. This is a huge problem for naturalism, by the way. Because as Richard Dawkins says, you are just dancing to your DNA. There is no substantial self in here. There is no soul. You are just genes. You're a gene replicating machine. There are no moral facts, because if there are moral facts, then there are immaterial things. But there are no immaterial things. There are only material things. And you are completely determined by your nature and your nurture. That's it. That's why you do what you do. The website naturalism.org, run by Tom Clark, a well-known naturalist, has the tenets of naturalism on it. And he says clearly on there, free will is an illusion. All thoughts, desires, hopes, and dreams do not arise from a substantial self inside, but they are just the products of physical forces of electrochemical interactions in the brain. How do you hold anyone responsible for such things? I met a guy at the University of Waterloo where I spoke at an open forum, and afterwards he came up to me and says, how can you say that only in a relationship with God can you have meaning in life? Why can't you have meaning in life with just the universe, if the universe is all there is? I said, well, let's just think about this for a second. Everything in the universe then is a closed system, cause and effect relationships, right? Yes. Everything in the universe is just made up of the smallest subatomic particles that just eventually all the other everything else just supervenes as it becomes in a higher complex relationship. So you have subatomic particles, then you have physics, then from physics you get chemistry, from chemistry you get biology, from biology you get psychology, from psychology it gets complex enough and you sort of get a person, right? Yeah, exactly. So all you are then is chemical, physical stuff. Yes, that's all you are. Well, if all you are is chemical, physical stuff, and all chemical, physical stuff operates in causal relationships within the universe, then anytime anyone does something, they're just doing it not because they chose to do it, but because they had no choice to do it. He said, yeah, I have no problem with that. I said, well, then what about justice? How do you hold people morally responsible? He said, because 51% of the population have brains that are causally constructed to think that this is good, and 49% have brains that think that this is good. So 51% determines the 49%. And so that's what morality is. And I said, so then when people do things that are bad, you don't think they're really doing anything bad. You just think that they're doing something that they are conditioned differently than the rest of the majority of society. Yes. So I gave him this horrific example of a girl who was kidnapped and buried alive in Florida. And I said, so what would you tell her parents? That this guy didn't really do anything wrong? And he said, well, I don't think that he did really anything wrong. He said, but I don't think that he should have done it. And I said, well, why do you think that? He said, well, because if everybody did that, then the gross domestic product would go down. And I said, why is the gross domestic product the standard for right and wrong and not this girl's life at least? And he said, well, I'm not that girl. And I said, well, I have news for you. You're also not the gross domestic product. And if I kicked you right between the legs as hard as I could right now, you would not lie on the ground and say, oh, well, I guess he didn't do anything wrong. He just did what his DNA was determining him to do. You would be angry and you would want some legal revenge taken, if not something else. So this is a huge problem for naturalism. Richard Dawkins just thinks that we have just we can rise above our evolutionary logical conclusions and take control of our destiny. But he's completely incoherent. But there's a hand over here.
that scenario, Chicago's not the one to blame, you're the one to blame because the morality responsibility passes through him. Well, then couldn't one argue that, well, God ultimately is morally responsible in the end anyways, because he's the one that chose to create Adam. He's the one that chose to have this higher standard of goodness. Because if God's ultimately responsible, then why are we then in the Bible responsible for our wrongdoings? And if that's the case, then Jesus dying isn't an act of grace, but it's just God satisfying his responsibility for his actions, I guess.
Yes. No, we're going to talk about that. That's the exact question. That's the $64,000 question. Where does moral responsibility stop? And can we say something intelligent about moral responsibility and stopping before it gets to God? Because that's a great question. If God is all-knowing and God's in control, and if he's in control of everything, depending on how we want to define and understand sovereignty, then it does seem like moral evil traces itself right back to God. And we don't want to say that. I know of people who do say that God is the cause of evil, that God chose to bring evil in the world. He laid the plan out, and he is actually the cause of evil. It's really hard then to say, well, then how is God not responsible if he's the direct cause of it? We need to talk about what it means to cause something. There's different kinds of cause: efficient, material, final, formal, those types of things. And does moral responsibility, is it transitive? Does it transfer back in this causal relationship? So that's the right question to ask. I have no idea why all the rest of these people are laughing at you. I have no idea why they're laughing at me. I'm the one who should be hurt. Okay. Let's go through. This is going to be kind of quick, but I'm glad you're going to have the PowerPoints for this. Here's a controversial premise. God can't create free moral agents that can never possibly go wrong. If we want to say that a moral world is a better world to have, that requires moral agents. Moral agents require genuine free will, the ability to choose moral good. God can't create a moral agent that's truly a moral agent. And we're not talking a good agent. We're just talking moral. And that means the ability to choose without giving them the ability to choose evil, because that would be a contradiction. There are lots of things that God cannot do. God can't lie, Hebrews says. God can't be tempted, James 1:13. God can't swear by anyone greater than himself, Hebrews 6:13. God can't deny himself, 2 Timothy 2:13. I have no reference for this because I just didn't take the time to get one, but I know that there's no verse that specifically says this, but there are lots of passages, especially in the Old Testament and the Psalms. Maybe you could even go Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where he says, I am that I am. But God cannot exist and not exist at the same time.
God cannot fall into temptation because of Jesus tempted, technically, but he didn't fall into temptation.
Well, James actually says God cannot be tempted.
Then wouldn't that be saying that Jesus isn't God?
That would be a different discussion. We can talk about it after, though, if you want. Yeah. I think in Jesus' humanity, I think he was tempted. I don't think he could sin. So think of it like this. Let's say you're locked in this room, and there's a great desire that you have on the outside of the door. Maybe it's a bad desire. Okay, I don't know what's out there. Maybe it's a stack of money that you know has been stolen from somewhere else. And we put you in here and say, well, we're going to test whether or not, you're a good person. We're going to test you so you experience temptation. So you sit here, and the money's on the other side of the door, and you don't know it, but we lock the door. So you couldn't go out and take that money even if you wanted to, but you don't know that. So you really do sit in here, and you fight the temptation to go and try and get out the door. Think of Jesus being a human and being tempted but unable to sin, perhaps in that light, that he probably was generally morally tempted on a human level. He never would have been able to act on that because God, is not, because in his divine nature, he's not going to be able to sin. But he didn't know it at the time, that he could not sin. So it was a genuine temptation. All it has to be for genuine temptation is for Jesus in his humanity to not know that he couldn't do it. Right? If you knew the door was locked and you couldn't get out there, it wouldn't be a temptation for you anyway. You'd be like, I can't do it. But if you don't know the door's locked and you think you can get out there, even if you can't live out your sinful desire, act it out, it still is a temptation for you. In some way, that's analogous perhaps to Jesus' temptation. So he couldn't sin. His divine nature can't sin. But he also has a human nature. And in his human nature, he can be tempted to sin. Now, don't ask me how to explain this. But in the relationship of the human and the divine nature precludes him from actually enacting his sin. Ben Shin can explain it all in complete detail for you. You can ask him afterwards. God can't violate the laws of logic. Now, God is not below logic. God is not beholden to logic. But the laws of logic are something that probably express, in our world, God's coherent rational thought. Logic is an abstract, universal, invariant law that we all reason and use every day, which is also hard to account for if you're a naturalist. But where does this come from? It seems like it needs an absolute, universal, invariant, necessary mind. Because logical laws are conceptual. They are not physical. You can't touch them. And if you need something if logical laws are necessary, which just means they exist in all possible worlds, you need something to house those logical laws that exist in all possible worlds that's equally necessary. They're invariant, they don't change, they're universal. And they're conceptual. So it seems like the mind of God is a good place for them. So logic is not something up and above God. It is just something that expresses the way he thinks. So he cannot deny his nature, because that's what it would entail. Right? He cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. He can't be both God and Satan. If he could violate the laws of logic, he could be both God and Satan at the same time. He could be holy and unholy. He'd be unable to lie and a big fat liar all at the same time. He could do that if he did not have to abide by logic. So logic is something that's really important, something that God abides by, because it's a reflection of his nature which he cannot deny. So if God can't create free moral agents that never go wrong, free agents then must be truly free. Otherwise, they're not a free agent. And God can't create fixity of the will. He can't say, you are a morally true free agent, but you can never choose any bad stuff. Because that would be like creating a square circle. That would be a violation of the laws of logic. And God doesn't do things like that. C.S. Lewis says, nonsense doesn't cease to be nonsense just because you put the phrase God can in front of it. Can God make a rock so big that not even he can move it? Well, Lewis says, look, that's just kind of a nonsense statement. When you break that down, it ends up being a logical contradiction. A morally significant action requires one to do it on one's own and the possibility of doing otherwise. And if that is the case, morally significant actions require free will.
Wouldn't this kind of nullify 5-point Calvinism?
Yes. Yeah, if you're a 5-point Calvinist, and yes, but what you can do, and if you're a pragmatist, okay.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, for a 5-point Calvinist, someone who's going to say, look, God does not give you this kind of free will, we're going to say, yeah, God gives you sort of free will, like which toothpaste you're going to use, but not which, not what, whether or not you're going to be able to actually willfully choose him, then this is going to be a defense that you're probably not going to be comfortable using. But you could say this. You might not even be comfortable saying this. Alvin Plantinga has done a good job of explaining this. Now, I don't hold the exact same theology that Alvin Plantinga holds, but if he's right, then, and even if I can modify my position a bit, then he's defeated the logical problem of evil. And for all I know, it's possible that I could be wrong. Something like that. Now, you don't have to use this. There are definitely other approaches that you could use. But this is probably the one that will get you the most traction somewhere.
You know how when in the Bible it says God made the earth in 7 days, and then some people say that like to God time is irrelevant, and out of time, wouldn't he be able to be out of logic?
If he was out of logic, then that would mean that he would also be in logic and out of logic at the same time.
Wait, so is he in time then?
Well, Because that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that because there's lots of different options on it. And there's actually even different theories of time. A theories of time, B theories of time. Is God watching time like you would watch a parade from a helicopter? He sees beginning, middle, and end all at once? Or is he, since he created the world, is he kind of going along in time with us even though he knows the end? I don't know. Those are all really tricky kinds of questions. But the question of time and the question of logic are distinct categories. So there'd be kind of a category error there that you would be making in comparing both of the two. Because to say God could be outside of logic would really mean then that God could be both inside of logic and outside of logic at the same time, which would be essentially meaningless. But it's a good question. Okay, well, we're getting close to the payoff here. Therefore, God can't create a world with moral good and without the possibility of moral evil, because such a world requires creatures with significant moral free will. If God says, I'm going to give you all moral free will, and you're going to have true moral free will, but you do not have freedom to choose evil, then you are not free morally. That's a contradiction. Now, if you want a world with moral good in it, you need people with free will. People with true free will can not only choose to do the good, but they can choose to do the evil. And that just logically follows from 1 through 3. The existence of God and the existence of evil is not logically incompatible. Therefore, the so-called logical problem of evil is really no problem at all. But this does raise significant questions, and here they are. If God chose to create the world, isn't he responsible for evil? Okay, we can say, yeah, people are responsible for evil because they make the moral choice, but God made people. Why did God create the world if he knew the evil and suffering that was going to come? And can God and the excessive amount of evil both exist? Yeah.
This is kind of going backwards, but why does there need to be free will to moral good? It's like, well, I know one point you made was like, then if there was no free will, then what kind of force? But in a way, I guess if you think about it, like forcing a child to share or like clean up or something, in a sense, the act itself is good. But I mean, I guess the child was forced to do it, but like in a sense, you could still say that it's good. You know what I'm saying? So like then maybe you could say that he can make a moral world and not offer free will. It's just the acts that they would be doing would be benefiting each other. But I mean, they don't have the free will to choose to do it or not. But it's still the act that's being forced upon them is good. So why is one of the premises saying that you can't make a morally good world without free will?
Okay, that's a good question. Did everybody hear it? Why can't you make a morally good world without free will? Why can't you just have people who are doing good for other people because they don't have a choice in it? That would still be a morally good world. Anybody want to jump in and respond to that? Okay, we'll go here and then here.
What defines evil? You know, we talk about sin. What is sin? Sin is not necessarily the right thing or a good thing or a bad thing, but it's about putting God first. Like, I don't know if this is right, but it's about relationship. And rather than talking about the actions that are produced, I think with your analogy of the child doing the right thing because they're told to do the right thing, at least they're producing the right thing, but more than thinking about that, think of the relationship between the father and the child. If the child had absolutely no will whatsoever, and I'm not saying do the right thing, but I'm saying love me, and forcing that child to love me, to care about me, do these things, and that child did that, but they had no choice in doing that, it devaluates, kind of like his thing about his wife. If his wife just said, I love you, I love you, I love you, it devalues that love. And because God he created us not because he needed our love, because he wanted to bless us by being able to be in a relationship with him. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not about what we do. It's not about the good that we do or the bad that we do. It's about the fact that we are in relationship with God. And because of our sin and our inability to make God first in our life in every aspect, right? Like, it's that free will. The free will that we're constantly choosing God first. That's what's good. But then anytime we don't choose God first, that's what's bad. And kind of letting you have the ability to choose God first makes God happy in the sense that he's not forcing you to choose him, but he's giving you an opportunity to either choose him or choose something else.
Yeah, I think that what he said is really right on. I think that what it comes down to is going to be relationship. I think God invites us into the relationship, into the joy and the love relationship that the Trinity has. He creates us to invite us in to experience that. And a real relationship requires this real choosing. Philip Yancey tells a story about when he interviewed Corrie ten Boom and her sister, who was in the German concentration camps, and they said that he came away from this interview saying that in the concentration camps, guards control every aspect of your life. They tell you what time to get up, they tell you what time to go to bed, they tell you when you can go to the bathroom, they tell you when to eat, they tell you what to eat, they tell you how much to eat, and they can force you and control and command you to do everything. But there's one thing that they cannot do. They cannot control whether or not you love them. That is something that has to be willfully chosen and given. Now, if you add to that the theory or the idea that part of the reason why God allows us to go through our experience in life is because there's a soul-making element to our existence. In that, in every decision that we make, we choose to either become more conformed to the image of Christ or grow closer to God, and we actually conform our soul to reflect Him more, or we don't. We choose to bruise our soul and conform it to our own selfish desires. So if soul-making is kind of a part of one of the aspects of our existence, God needs to give us this moral free will so that we can actually have a true relationship with Him, an interactive kind of, I'm choosing. And He doesn't just force us to do the good things, because He wants us to willfully choose to want to be like Him and conform ourselves to Him more and more.
Would it be safe to say that when God created the world, His priority for relationship was higher than just the morally good world?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. But there's someone else over here. Oh, okay.
Well, I thought the question was why can't you create a where everyone is morally good world?
Mm.
And that question is just answered when I say that morality that everyone is morally good.
Right.
There's no moral
Sure.
bad. So I think that you're not going to
I was gonna say, like, if you don't have people, you won't know what good is.
It might actually be the other way around. You don't know what evil is unless you know what good is. Evil is like parasitic on good. Unless you have... But that's okay. All right, you guys have been great, but it's let me just kind of go through this and we'll take some questions, because I think the most important thing to get to is this last little section. But here's the couple questions that arise. Okay, why isn't God responsible for evil in the world? He's the one who chose it, chose to create the world. Doesn't that make Him culpable in some way? And one of the things we can say to this is, no, it does not make Him responsible. Now, you may say, okay, it may not make Him responsible, but why did He choose to bring it into existence anyway? That's the second question. So we're just talking about responsibility here for evil. We're going to say because causation or responsibility in this sense is not transitive. The responsibility does not transfer all the way back to God. Now, if you're at a go-kart place and you're riding your little go-kart and you come around the corner and there's a guy there who's spun out and you crash into him, and then another guy crashes into you, and another guy crashes into you, and another guy crashes into you. Okay, at the end, this last guy comes flying around the corner and he smashes into this guy, who hits this guy, who hits this guy, who hits this guy, who hits you, who hits that guy and bumps him ahead. Who caused this guy to get bumped back on the track? Well, I did. But who caused me? Well, this guy. Who caused this guy? Well, this guy. Well, this guy. Well, this guy. This guy is actually the cause, way back here, for this guy getting bumped onto the track. Okay, that would be causative. The cause and the responsibility transfers all the way back through the causes to the final cause. But in this case, we want to say that's not the way that it goes, because there are lots of examples of things causing things to happen, but we don't hold them morally responsible. Here's one. God no more causes evil in the world by bringing it into existence than a father is the cause of the actions of his son, even though he caused him to exist. If my son becomes a postal worker someday and just goes psycho and goes postal, as they say, no one's coming back to me and saying, you're responsible for his actions, unless it's really clear that I, trained him to be that way. And no one's going to go back to my father and say, well, you caused him and he caused him, and so you're ultimately responsible. We kind of recognize that it doesn't really work like that. And there are other examples in life. And the reason why it stops here is because in event causation, one event causes another. You can, if you knew, you could go all the way back and trace through all of the events, all of the dominoes you could find, but not in agent causation. Agent causation is the only other kind of form of causation where a willed, intentional agent, a person, makes the choice. And in examples of moral issues, agent causation is the final sense of causation. And so, because God gives people sort of this sub-sovereignty to make choices in the world, they ultimately are responsible. Now, you might say, well, why did God bring the world into existence? What would justify that? But he's not morally culpable.
Oh, I was going to ask about original sin, like the concept of that, doesn't that follow that same track of causality? So, if we're saying that, certain things like that don't have causality, then why doesn't that apply to, or why doesn't that apply to original sin? It seems like that's traced back
To who?
to Adam.
Right. And we would say he's morally responsible for that.
So then why is Adam's children also morally responsible for Adam?
That's a good question. And one of the arguments would be for that, this gets into theological arguments of, because the Bible says we were all in Adam. Adam is the representative head of the human race. And so how that gets transferred and what does it mean for us all to be in Adam and him to be our representative in making the choice, I'm not exactly quite sure.
Can we add on to this and say, yeah, it's God's not responsible for the evil in this world, but he, even go a step further, even though he wasn't responsible, he still chose to take up the responsibility of it by sending his son
Sure.
to die on the cross for
Yes.
us, and which basically took up all the responsibility of all the things, all the dirty things we've done. And that way, it's like this question becomes almost irrelevant, because even if God was responsible, he already has taken care of it.
And that's the reason why I think that we can say at the end of the day, when people say, okay, so God is not, God and evil can coexist. And okay, we don't, and maybe God allowed evil to come in the world, but then why should I trust that he really is good? What can I trust about him? Because he's this God who let this bad stuff always happen. That's why Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the tears of God. He comes into the world and he is the personal answer to this question where we say, well, this is why, and we point people to Jesus. So yes, I think that's a great add-on.
Your argument on that you can't say the causation, you're saying you can't use the causation with God. But I kind of think of it as like, what if, so God created man, and man with free will, they could do good or bad. But if you think about it, like, there's also the possibility that, so like, I think that, like, what if you have this person and you flip a coin, and if it's heads, they die. It's better that you don't flip a coin at all. But I kind of say that God flipped the coin. So isn't that causation right there? Okay, just
Which I think that's where I would say, to someone who said that, I would say, yeah, so therefore, if what you're saying is God is responsible because he chose to make us, and because he chose to make us free agents.
Oh, I don't.
My voice is loud enough. Because we're already free agents, like he chose to do it. And so yeah, you could say God is responsible. You could be like, you could hate him for that. All you want. But at the end of the day, God has provided a way out of it. Because I think it's like this, like Jesus isn't just even covering our sins in the sense of he's responsible and he's taking care of it, like by sending Jesus, and he just took care of it, he like paid it off. No, I think it was more than that. It was like he realizes, the plight of our sin, and even if he was responsible, he paid the price, and it was greater than what I'm saying. It's like the sacrifice he made completely would nullify the idea that he was responsible. I think he wanted us to sin. You know what I'm saying? Like, why would he want to kill his son? Does that make sense? Like, if he knew like he was gonna flip the coin and he was gonna be responsible, and he had to pay the price, and the price would be killing his son in order for us to live, I think that like takes away the idea that, you know, when God did it, he was thinking, okay, you know, they're gonna sin. I want them to sin.
But is your question like, but why did he start the whole process off to begin with, even if he knew there's going to be so much brokenheartedness and sadness and lostness and sin and hell and those kinds of things? Like,
Yeah, I'm just being like, my question doesn't reflect on my faith or anything. I'm just like logically.
yeah, are you some kind of a plant in here from the University of California, Irvine, or something like that?
Just with the argument with causation. Yeah. Because wouldn't that be causation?
Oh yeah, certainly God is the cause, but he's the efficient cause. He's the necessary cause for it. So he chose to bring it in, and so but he's not morally responsible for the evil in the world. But then the question is he justified in making that choice? That's, I think, maybe your question is even if he's not the cause of moral evil, he's the cause of the whole world that has evil in it, and so therefore what reason could there ever be that would justify him bringing the world into existence when he knows that this bad stuff's going to happen? And that's a really good question, and we'll take a look at it in just a second, but you had your hand up. I just wanted to make sure.
I wasn't, sorry. It was because I don't know if it's like a similar question as this question, but then I was just looking at that, and you were comparing that to like the father-son analogy, and then how like the sin doesn't transfer, like the causation doesn't transfer to the father. But then like with the father-son analogy, I feel like in that scenario, like the father doesn't really have the control over the son. Like, I mean, you never know what the son is going to become, right? But then in case of God, like if God is like all-knowing and all-powerful, and then he has the
That's
control
right.
over the son, like
That's
what
right.
is it going to turn into?
That's right.
Yeah.
What justifies God in knowing what is going to happen
Yeah. And
in making the choice?
yeah, but then like doesn't that make the whole responsibility like transfer up? Like I feel like the causation can't transfer argument doesn't really fit the model. I feel like so. I don't know if that like to me that that answer there doesn't really answer
Mm-hmm.
the question. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right, and it may not. Let me give you one more quick attempt at maybe making one distinction that might help. When we're talking about is God morally responsible for the evil in the world? That's specifically what we're asking. Is God responsible for this, morally responsible? I want to say, no, he's not morally responsible. As a matter of fact, he's responsible. Human beings are responsible. It stops at the agent causation of the individual human being. But the next question is, okay, if he's not morally responsible for the evil in the world, then what could ever justify him bringing that world into existence? Because the responsibility is sort of bracketed out at this point, and now the question is there any justification, any good reason why he could bring a world into existence? And you might be able to say this, that is morally significant enough that would not make him morally responsible, I guess, for causing the world. Yeah, I know. It didn't make that much sense to me either. Right, here's the question. Look, even if he's not responsible for the evil in the world, is he justified for bringing the world into existence when he knew the evil that would result? This is kind of your question, right? Yeah. Well, this is what some people have offered. And this is where you start getting into theodicy. But before we even make any kind of a suggestion at that, let me just say this. What reasons would ever justify God in creating a world with evil? Here's the best answer. If we don't know what God's reasons for choosing to create the world are, we're not in a position to judge whether he has sufficient reasons or not. Right? Now, this sort of might be a cop-out in a way. Like people might say, oh, well, you got... But look, how could, we want to say, but how could God ever be justified? How could we ever give any kind of reason, any morally significantly good reason to bring in a world that has all this moral bad? Is he not at least morally responsible for bringing the world into existence that has bad people in it? What reason would get him off the hook? Because there are reasons, right? Like, what reason could there ever be for killing this guy? I can't think of any. Well, I'm going to tell you as his defense lawyer, he's not guilty. Well, why not? I'm going to tell you there's a moral reason that is significant enough that will diffuse the prosecution's argument and show you that this guy is not an immoral person. Well, in the case of God, since he hasn't divulged to us what his reasons are for bringing the world in, it's kind of, he hasn't said to us, here was my criteria for going ahead with the decision, we're not in a position to judge whether he has good reasons or not. But this is where a theodicy will get involved and say, yeah, but we need to say something positive here. So it seems that all that's required for God to be justified in creating this world is if in the end it would be better than that the world had existed than had it not. This is debatable. You could debate this. You might say, I don't really like that. But if in the end it is better that God brought this world into existence than if he didn't, then God might be justified. And it's at least conceivable that this world with all of its evil is the necessary condition for something fantastic. William Lane Craig, who teaches at Talbot, says, God may well have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. We all know cases in which we permit suffering because we have morally sufficient reasons for doing so. Suppose, for example, that God's purpose for human life is not happiness in this life, but the knowledge of God, which is an incommensurable good. It may be the case, for all we know, that only in a world suffused with natural and moral evil would the maximum number of people freely come to know God and find eternal life. Now, this is a for all we know kind of an argument. It goes back to, it's conceivable. So God hasn't given us reasons, so we can't judge his reasons as good or bad. But it's at least conceivable that he does have reasons, and it's because there's a great good that will come about from it. Holocaust. Yeah, it's hard to see probably from where you are.
It's just a comment, but that seems very like utopianistic to me. Like it's just like there's all the problems that come with that kind of like thinking, like how you measure.
Oh, yeah, but what he's meaning is that the incommensurable good is going to be found at the end of the book of Revelation, right? Not in this world. Yeah, he means that it's conceivable that maybe this is the way that the world had to be for the maximum number of free people to make a choice to follow him. And this is what Dostoevsky says in The Brothers Karamazov. This is one brother talking to his other brother. He says, I believe like a child that the suffering will be healed and made up for, that all humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, for all the blood that they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. That's Dostoevsky, who himself experienced quite a bit of suffering in life. Well, look, you can take a look at these later, because I don't want to keep you for the rest of the night. Oh, by the way, we won't sin in heaven. So, because people will say, hey, well, if, you need to have free will to be a moral creature. Why not? Why not? Why wouldn't you sin in heaven? And maybe the answer is something like, you'll have the free will to sin in heaven, but maybe you just won't choose to sin in heaven because you will, because you will be a glorified being in the presence of Jesus. And my wife she has the free will to put our children in the microwave if she wants to, but she'd never act on it, right? It's despicable. Yeah. Yes, both of you guys. Sure.
So there was a possibility that sin could be committed.
Yeah. It's definitely, we have a prime example of the possibility of it happening, the actuality of it. But I think the distinctions would be that we're not only going to be like Adam and Eve, I don't believe. I think we will actually be better than Adam and Eve. We are going to have a glorified body. We have the mind of Christ. We are partakers of the divine nature. We are not just going to be like Adam and Eve in the sense that it was possible for us to sin. But I think that it'll be significantly different than any kind of nature that any angel ever has. So that might be a theological response to that. Let's just skip the gratuitous problem of evil. The gratuitous problem of evil is a really simple answer. Is someone says, look, there's no good reason that God could ever have for so much evil in the world. You've persuaded me. God and evil are not incompatible. But so much evil is incompatible with God. God has no good reason for it. And you just say, well, how could you ever know what God's reasons would ever be? Right? I mean, I can't understand. Like I told you, calculus I don't understand. Try explaining physics to your dog or a cat. I mean, there's just such a gulf between us and the mind of God that even if God had reasons, what would ever make us think that we'd be able to understand them or know them? We're not in an epistemic position to be able to make that judgment.
So wouldn't that break all logic with God? Like, how can we logically compare God to God with our minds? Because God is such a higher being, therefore we can't compare God.
No, I think Isaiah says, that his ways are higher than our ways, but that they are not of a different kind or radically, illogically different than our ways. But I do think that, if we have a difficult time understanding, like they think that they just found the Higgs boson particle just recently, and we don't really know what's going on at the quantum level. It's beyond our ability to even know it, perhaps, because every time we take a look at it, we cause a change in what we're observing. I think those types of things may be examples of just how God's ways are above our ways, but they're not of a different kind in a logical sense, differently than our ways. So he may do things that don't seem reasonable to us, but I don't think that he's doing anything that is actually logically, defying the laws of logic. Okay, let's just end with this. This is Bob the believer. Bob says, okay, but look, so how do I respond to this? I'm not going to be able to articulate some, free will defense or whatever every time I bump into somebody or any objection that comes my way. Well, here's what I think you will hopefully be able to take away from tonight that's practical. Here's the first thing you do anytime anyone asks you a question. You say to this, what do you mean by evil? Because it's not a joke, it's not a game, it's not a trick, but you want them to tell you what they mean by evil. Or, I can't believe in God. What do you mean by believe? I can't believe in God. What do you mean by God? Because what if they say, I can't believe in a God who's up in heaven, he has a long white beard, and he's just playing with us like puppets, and you say, oh yeah, I can't believe in that God either. Or I can't believe that there's a force out there like an Avatar or whatever. Oh, I don't believe in that either. Right? You kind of make people explain what they're saying so they know what they're talking about, you know what they're talking about, because this actually allows us to have real conversation and real communication. And it also forces them to explain what they mean. It's really easy to be a critic. It's really easy to just say, I can't believe this because it's dumb. I demand proof. What do you mean by proof? What exactly do you want? Right? So you need to ask. Anytime someone asks you, says, look, and practice this with each other as you got to, go through your eating lunch. You're like, oh yeah, this is the greatest university I've ever been at. What do you mean by the greatest? Like it's the largest, it's the most academically sound. Like, what do you mean by greatest? That's a really important question. Question number 2 is going to be this. You're going to ask the skeptic this question. How did you come to the conclusion that God and evil are incompatible? How did you come to this conclusion? You want to know where they got this information from. Is it just from their own head? Is it because they watched an episode of television? Are they quoting some kind of an authority? Did they get it from a university professor? This just allows the discussion to keep going. And Jesus asks people questions all the time when they come to him. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Why do you call me good? Right? There are lots of times when he does this. Go through and look at the questioning method of Jesus because it reveals their assumptions. It reveals their hidden assumptions that they may not have a ground for. You may say, okay, now that I know what you're talking about, evil, God, we've defined our terms, and you say something like, the free will defense. You articulate God and evil are compatible, etc. You say, think about it this way. But then you're going to reverse the role. You're going to do this. You're going to say, but can you explain something for me? Can you help me understand something? And you do it nicely. And you say, how do you account for evil in your worldview? Because it's not just Christians who have to, but let's say he's a naturalist, an atheist, and he says, how do you account for evil? He says, well, what do you mean? I might say something like this. Evil is a warping or a perversion of the way things should be. You shouldn't do that. You ought not to do that. This is bad. Why? Because you shouldn't do it. There is a prescriptive aspect of things that are evil. I should not torture babies for fun. But why should I not torture babies for fun? There is an unstated assumption going on in here, right? That babies are people, that people are valuable, that... I met a guy in the street who was handing out brochures once for a political campaign, and I asked him, why he was doing it, and he said, well, I'm out here because this guy's the only hope for the whole world economically. And I said, well, why do you care about the whole world? And he said, because it's made up of people. And I said, why do you care about people? He said, because people are valuable. I said, well, why do you think people are valuable? He said, because I think people are good. I said, well, why do you think people are good? He said, because I think they have souls. I said, well, where do you think their souls come from? He said, I have no idea. I said, can I recap our conversation? He said, so you're out here because you think that people are valuable because they're good, and they're good because they have souls, but you have no idea where their souls comes from, so you essentially have no idea why you're out here. And it was a nice conversation. We had a nice conversation after that. I didn't say it as straightforward as that, right? But there's an assumption that he has that he doesn't seem to have a ground for. Right? So evil assumes there's a way that things ought to be. Evil assumes that there's a way that things ought to be. If there's a way that things should be, that means they must have a purpose. So consider a tennis racket. I can say to you, stop hitting that person with a tennis racket. Why? Because it's wrong. Why? Because that's not what the tennis racket's for. You're using it in an illegitimate manner. You're warping it. You're perverting it. Tennis rackets are to be playing tennis. But if we go to the beach and we both find a pile of garbage that's just been strewn about by the wind and the waves, and I take it home and throw it, and use it as like a doorstop, and you put it up on the wall and think it's a nice piece of art. No one's going to say you shouldn't do that and you shouldn't do that, or he should do that but you shouldn't do that, or vice versa, because there is no essence or nature to this pile of garbage. Why? Because it has no purpose. Why doesn't it have any purpose? Because there's no intentional mind behind it that has designed it with a purpose. When we say that projector is not working the way that it should be, we can only say it should be working a certain way because it has a purpose. The only reason it has a purpose is because it was designed. If things have a purpose, then there must be an intelligence behind them. So, if there's no God, then there's no mind behind the universe or anything in it. And that means there's no purpose, which means there's nothing to violate, and that means that there's no evil. There can be is, but no ought. He is lying on the side of the road, or he is being beaten up. They ought not do that. It's hard to go from the is of the fact to the ought of the value unless you have a bridge value in there that says they ought not do that because that person is created in the image and likeness of God and has true value, and they're distorting that value. That's not what God designed bodies for. So, you said that you could not, it should be, is that a comma? Yeah. You said you couldn't believe in God because of the problem of evil, but it seems that you have no right to that objection because in your world there's no such thing as evil. So you have to assume my worldview even to make the objection of evil. These are the things you want to do in a conversation. Whenever you answer a question, always clarify. What do you mean? You can ask that question over and over and over again until you find something that you are comfortable talking about. How'd you come to that conclusion? This is actually a nice way of dialoguing with people because you're not preaching at them. You're letting them talk to you. You're letting them explain their view. You're hearing what they have to say. It's not combative. It's diplomatic. And you're sharing ideas. Then you can provide an answer. Hey, have you thought about this? Oh, and by the way, can you explain to me? Can you help me understand why, if you think it's okay to abort a baby inside the womb, it's not okay to kill the baby after it's born? What's the distinction that you have there? Because that just seems like location to me. Right? I think it's wrong because this is a true person, because it bears the image and likeness of God. You think it's a collection of tissue and magically gets rights after it comes out the birth canal? That just seems pretty arbitrary. Can you explain that for me? Why it's a person then but not 5 minutes before? So you need to ask those kinds of questions. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Can you explain something for me? Well, when I go back to school in September, I'm going to tell all of my Korean students that I know that it is possible for them to stay awake in class. Because I have evidence that it occurs. There is a ton of things left to say, but we're not going to say anything more. But I'm really happy to take any kind of questions on any broad topic, too, not just the problem of evil.
I sort of feel guilty for asking you this question because it's probably like the biggest theological bombshell, and I'm not exactly sure whether or not it falls under apologetics exactly. But given everything that we said, like how we define the whole argument of evil with using the free will argument, how then do you wrap your mind around like Romans 9, like basically like how God is saying, like when we say like God, like Paul does this thought experiment where he's like, okay, you might say to God like, why do you blame me, God, because you made me this way, like you made me with the capacity, like you made me a certain way, like so like because of like everything that he said before in Romans, he's like, why then should I be held responsible for my actions, like because you're the one that made me this way, and then Paul like sort of gives a like it seems like a seemingly cop-out answer of like how dare you, like why do you, like the potter has rights over his clay, so he decides what he chooses to do with the clay kind of thing. But then that just like can, and I'm not saying like for you to personally like give your beliefs, because
Sure.
obviously there's theologians have been arguing about this for centuries, but my question is like when you encounter something like this, how do you approach this kind of like this type of criticism, like because this basically splits Arminianism and 5-point Calvinism or 4-point Calvinism, whatever. So like if somebody disagrees with you on a theological level about something like this, how can you defend, because it's not really against God, but it's just against an attack against like what's in the Bible itself. So I feel like it's very hard to like, this is where a lot of people can like split in a lot of ways and get in a lot of like fights or discussions about like how do you approach this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad that you phrased it in kind of a general way to say, here's a good example, Romans 9. How do you kind of go about addressing the whole problem of that? I think it's a difficult question to answer. I ask myself it quite often, and that is, do I interpret the Bible in light of my philosophy, or do I interpret my philosophy in light of what I think the Bible teaches? And I think it's really hard. I think it's a circular process. I think they both inform each other. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the Bible is going to be my final criterion for truth. But when I have these deeply held intuitions about the fact that God is not choosing to send anyone to hell, that free will really means that you have a moral choice to make, that God is looking for relationships, and I read, everyone has to make sense of those verses, whether you're coming from it from a Calvinist point of view or from more of an Arminian point of view. And so the verses are there. It's how do you interpret them in light of often your intuitions, right? So Calvinists have a strong intuition of what it really means, sovereignty really means and must mean. Arminians have a view of what free will means and must mean. And so therefore you kind of try and make a coherent picture of all the verses in the Bible and make a model that you think best
Like
pictures
model.
it. Yes.
It's just, I feel like, but there's no like way, I feel like there's just no way to end the conflict though. It's just going to be a never-ending conflict.
Yeah.
It's
I think you're right. I don't think that people are going to, but there's a book by Clark Pinnock's the editor. It's called The Grace of God, The Mind of Man and the Grace of God, The Will of Man and the Grace and the Mind of God. And it has an article in there by William Lane Craig, and he goes through and lays out what he calls a Calvinist Arminian rapprochement, which is a bringing together. And it's his Molinist view, a Molinism and a congruenism view that gets you really close to a 5-point Calvinist perspective, almost all the sovereignty you want, but yet he still retains individual freedom to choose. And so there would be an attempt at doing something like that.
I have two questions. Why couldn't Jesus come earlier? Like maybe starting with like creation, and also why was God so selective in the Old Testament when just choosing people if his goal was to be with like the maximum amount of people?
Yeah, why didn't God choose? Why didn't Jesus come earlier, and why did God choose one group of people and not? Ultimately, I don't think I know the answer to that question. I think I would probably say something along the lines of um, that God, in why did He didn't choose Jesus to come earlier? Um, William Lane Craig makes the argument that Jesus comes at exactly the best point in time for the spread of the gospel. That if Jesus had come earlier, then it wouldn't have been able to spread in the way that it spread with the Roman roads and Jerusalem sort of being the center of the world, the crossroads of the world. So to be able to gossip the gospel, this is the best time for him to come. I'm not really sure what I think about that. I'm not really sure, why didn't Jesus just come immediately and die on the cross right afterwards? Maybe the fall is such a radical thing. I don't know, but I'm sure that there are sort of some biblical theologians who would have a better answer to that than me. I'm sure that Ben probably actually has some thoughts on it. I'm serious when I say that. Why didn't Jesus come earlier?
Actually, I think I have an answer. It's not a perfect answer, but I think one way that you can really understand it is by looking at the parable of the tenants and the landlord. Right? Because your question is, well, why didn't Jesus come earlier? But when you look at the parable of the vineyard, the owner rented it out to people, and then once it was time to receive his dues, he sent his servants, which was to signal the prophets. So in a way, the father was trying to, I guess, bring them back, or try to save them, without actually having to send his son to die for them, kind of thing. But like in the parable, it kept saying like they either they beat them up, they killed them, or they shamed them, disgraced them, and sent them back. And in the parable, in the end, it's like, oh, the father thought, oh, if I send my son, maybe that is a respect. That was actually the symbol of Jesus. So I don't know. In a way, you could say that God was still trying to reach out to his people as well, to the world. But in a way, you could say that it was our wickedness, our sin that finally brought God to the point where his last option was to send his son.
But if he's all knowing, why would he send after it's done?
Well, I guess he knew that it would. I don't know. I guess he knows, but in the end, like we could blame him. But I would really say it's our fault. Why? It's like God sent it with good intentions, but I think maybe you could say this goes along with free will, because like God sent it with good intentions, but God gave us the desire, the will to whether it's sent or not. And you can say, oh, why is it, and why did this happen? But it's more of like, why did we choose not to listen?
Did you want to? Do you have a question? Okay, why don't we take this one? It's 9 o'clock. This will be the last question. I'll stick around and hang out. If you ever have any kind of questions, I'm sure you have people in your life that you can do this with. But if you don't, you could always find me on Facebook and message me or something like that. But here's the last one for tonight.
I want to have a question about the evolution, and then I think the best way to ask that question is approach with the episode of Futurama. And I'm pretty sure someone else had watched it, but then again, like I watched it when I was still in college and was watching Mission on the TV, and then there's like the monkey guy, and then like he was arguing with this like this. Sorry, this like I don't know the name because I didn't watch the thing, but then again, there's like the scientist guy, and then like the scientist guy trying to prove the theory of evolution that like there's like the skull, the most recent skull, and then like there's like a really old skull, and then like but then the monkey guy was supposedly Christian, and he was like, but there's no link that connects between that, and then like scientist guy, oh, but there is a link, and then he shows the link, but then the monkey guy was like, but there's no link between that.
Yeah.
And then, like it just keeps on going on for like everyone until like everyone who watches just leaves, and then like up to the point where they actually like the monkey guy wins because the science couldn't like provide that the one link out of like 5,000 links, and then like those are the questions that I actually receive a lot from like non-believers, like saying like, oh, like Christians not trying to like the only way the Christian can prove that they are right is by proving others wrong, and the Christians just cannot stand on their own truth. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So, like,
yeah.
Like this is so how should I approach this?
So the question is, so you're saying that people are going to argue and say, you guys don't have good reasons for what you believe. You just take by faith your position and just show everyone else to be false.
Something like that, and then you know how like also
Specifically about evolution or just anything in general?
well everything in general, and also the evolution question, like how that actually works.
Yeah. Well, again, I think I would ask them with a respond with a question. I think I would say, what do you mean that we don't have any reasons for what we believe? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by reasons? And I'd want to hear what they say. You have no good arguments. Well, then you could say, oh, okay, how'd you come to that conclusion? Like, oh, because.
For evolution, they do have an argument that they have like the evidence.
Oh, sure, but I guess personally myself, I wouldn't even bother arguing the evolution argument, and here's why. Because it's dogma. Every discipline in the university, that's the only thing that they have in common. Naturalism and the football team. That's the only thing disciplines in the university have in common, right? They're all disparate. They all have different positions on everything, except it's all evolutionary naturalism that undergirds it. So you're never going to win an argument on that one. And I think I would just say, look, evolution and the existence of God are completely compatible. I don't believe in macroevolution. I don't think that God did it that way. But look, if this is going to be a problem for somebody to say, I can't become a Christian because you're going to make me believe in creation, I'd say, hey, well, then let's just set that aside and talk about whether or not you think God exists and talk about Jesus. And eventually it's going to get back to Genesis and original sin and stuff like that. But I think that there are certainly Christians who are not, who are theistic evolutionists. So I would probably not even bother arguing the issue of evolution because it's practically probably not going to get very far with anybody. Do you really feel like you have to kiss your brain goodbye on that one if you're going to become a Christian?
I'd like to say, two. Wow, John, I've never.
It's like being on a parade float.
Hey, I want to say that, I've never heard you teach before, John, except just briefly, but he did a fine job. Let's thank John.
Thank you.
Wow.